Well, hello there once again, my young friends. It's Mr. Johnson coming to you here from Westlake High School in Johnson Land, classroom 408. Ready to crank up Act 3. I hope you're at least semi-interested in the play at this point. A lot of what Act 1 and 2 is, much like any story in the beginning, is setting up characters and things to where the real story takes place, I guess, the meat of the story. And certainly, while we did have some useful revelations, we had some things go on in the first couple of acts. We had a ghost arrive and say, "This is how I died, get revenge," that sort of thing. We're just getting to the part of the story where, again, kind of the meat of the story is happening. So we're starting in Act 3, and for this particular act, there's so much that goes on in it. For testing purposes, you'll have a test just on this act. It won't be like when you took one on Acts 1 and 2, and it was two whole acts. It's just one act, but there's plenty of things that are happening to where we can kind of measure what you've learned when we take a test. Starting in Act 3, page 51, Rosie and Gildy are with the king, and the king wants to know if they've learned anything specific about Hamlet, what's going on with him, and they're like, well, no, we really weren't able to get anything from him. And the king basically tells them, top page 52, just to continue doing what it is that you're doing, try to figure out, what's happening with him. So Polonius and Claudius plan to hang out behind the curtain. Their plan is to eavesdrop on the conversation between Hamlet and Ophelia. They're sending Ophelia out to speak to Hamlet. The queen says, and for this particular quote, just know the speaker on page 52, "And for your part, Ophelia, I do wish that your good beauties be the happy cause of Hamlet's wildness." I hope that your beauty, his love for you, I hope that the reason he is in madness is because of you, and that way maybe you and your beauty can reach him, can kind of get him back and whatnot. At the bottom of page 52, 2.5 lines starting with "we will bestow," maybe you should mark those. "We will bestow ourselves, read on this book that shows such an exercise may color your loneliness." We're going to hide ourselves, read on this, and what they hand her is a little prayer book, basically a book of devotions. Usually when you see this performed on stage, and when Hamlet first sees her, he's like, "Remember me in your prayers." It's kind of clear that she's reading some sort of prayer book. And that's such kind of a fake, such a hypocrisy really is what's happening. So you have the king saying at the bottom of page 52, just know the speaker for this line, "Oh, 'tis too true, how smart a lash that speech doth give my conscience." I have a guilty conscience. We know kind of what he is, or at least we think we know what he is. And he says he has a guilty conscience. So they all leave, and before she actually speaks to him, we shift to Hamlet walking around, saying probably the most famous words really in any play in the history of the language, really, the "to be or not to be" soliloquy that we have. And you have marked 4.5 lines to start it. And for your purposes, I am not, though it is very popular and oft used passage, I'm not going to have you discussing this particular passage on the test. But I think it's worth noting that Hamlet says it. So just know the speaker. "To be or not to be, that is the question, whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing in them." Is it worth it to continue to live through all of these slings and arrows, the difficulty, the trouble, the struggles that is just inherent in being a human being? Is it worth it to just continue and try to end this, as he puts it, sea of troubles? And it's almost like the idea of knowing, even if you do end them, then tomorrow there'll be more. He's really looking at his life and his circumstances in a very, very dark way. And obviously in this play, he seems to be contemplating something he mentioned earlier in his first soliloquy in the play, the idea of suicide and the fact that God has a canon against self-slaughter. He said earlier, here he is like, is it worth it to continue to live? And in kind of philosophizing about that, there's a very important passage, if you go down a little bit, starting with "for in that sleep of death." There are 4 lines, that are really, really worth marking. "For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil," this body. "It must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life." In that sleep of death, what dreams may come. If throughout this soliloquy he is using the metaphor that sleep kind of equates to death, then the idea that is when you go to sleep or when you die, what dreams will you have, or what is the afterlife? he basically says here in this quote is the fear, what makes us pause, what makes us stop when we think about ending our lives, is the fear of what's out there after death. If I take my life, will I go to hell? If I end my life in this way, are there consequences in the dreams that may come, the life that comes after this life, or the death that comes after this life? At the bottom of the page, I would mark the last 6 lines. He kind of reemphasizes that again, the idea of dying and what's on the other side. Last 6 lines on the page: when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin. Any of us could settle our own accounts with a dagger. Who would fardels bear? Who would carry these burdens, to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country, whatever's out there on the other side, from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will. Those are 6 pretty key lines in this particular soliloquy. He's basically saying, why? I mean, you talk about just a really cynical way of seeing the world at this point, but that's part of being in a state of maybe depression, just not seeing yourself, not seeing really the good things in life at all. All you can see is that dark cloud. All you can see is the pain that is just part of you every day. He basically says, why would any of us just continue to live, to grunt and sweat under this weary life? Why would we just keep going through this and carry these burdens if we could just end it, except for the undiscovered country? What's on the other side? If there is an actual eternal hell, is that something that, we'd be willing to pay? Is that a price to be willing to pay? We don't know what's out there, so we stay here and we continue to struggle through this life. Over the next page, top 54, on the 3rd line, I highly encourage you, mark this line: thus conscience does make cowards of us all. Consciousness, self-awareness. We're humans. Animals don't necessarily, as far as we know, have any kind of consciousness. They don't consider their soul. They don't consider an afterlife or an eternal death afterlife. They don't consider a heaven or a hell. We have self-awareness as humans, so we are cowards when we won't end our lives. Interesting that he gives kind of a contradiction to what we maybe often think. Maybe we would think that suicide is kind of the coward's way out, which is a harsh way of looking at it, but that's the way that some do, that a person was afraid to continue on forward in their life. He says we're afraid to end our lives, so we just continue to trudge through all these things and arrows. So basically, he gets through this soliloquy where he's just contemplating his existence and humans in general. Is it worth all these things? We're cowards when we won't take our lives. And you see toward the end of that speech there, a couple of lines from the end, he says, "Saw you now the fair Ophelia, nymph in thy orisons, thy prayers, be all my sins remembered." He sees her walking about with a book of prayers, and she's ironically kind of doing what he's been doing for weeks. She's walking around pretending to read. She's kind of walking around pretending to pray. So she comes to him, and I highly encourage you, Mark, the 3 lines starting with, "My Lord, I have remembrance of yours, that I have longed and longed to redeliver. I pray you now receive them." She knew she was getting sent out here. She hasn't really maybe had the chance to achieve any kind of closure in this relationship with Hamlet. So she shows up with remembrances, with gifts. We know there have been letters. We saw one of them read to Hamlet's parents. Gift trinkets, usually when you see this represented on stage, depends on the movie, depends on the theater production, but sometimes she'll have letters, sometimes she'll have a little box, sometimes maybe there's a little jewelry like a necklace or something. But whatever the case is, she's trying to give back to him gifts that he's giving her. I've longed and longed, I've wanted for a long time to redeliver these gifts. He looks at her and says, "I never gave you anything." And again, remember, he's pretending to be in madness. He knows he gave her gifts. He's just pretending that he didn't. You have a quote there, which is very worthy of discussion. And it's very, I'm so proud of her in this moment that she's kind of bold, and she says, "No, you know right well you did, my honored lord. And with them words of so sweet breath as made things more rich." It's not just that you gave me these gifts. Along with the gift, you gave me words that made the gifts even that much more special. So the idea here is maybe he has actually used the L word. Maybe he has actually told her that he loved her. He said a lot of very sweet things to her. Even the letter that he wrote her, I don't have the words to express how I really feel, except to say that I love you the best, the most. I love you as much as my heart will allow. She stands up for herself here in trying to maybe achieve closure. No, you take these gifts, because you did give them to me, but not just the gifts, words along with them. At the very bottom of page 54, I encourage you mark kind of the end of his speech, just the last 4 words, and her response as well. Maybe the last couple of lines on page 54 and the first couple of lines on page 55. He says, I did love you once. And she says, indeed, my Lord, you made me believe so. And then he goes to the top of the next page, said, you should not have believed me. And he ends that little speech by saying, I loved you not. This is such a dagger. You can almost see him saying, oh, I did love you once. He's pretending to be insane, but he gives her just that little light like he does. Remember, I did love you once. And she has that moment of relief, like, oh my gosh. He does remember, indeed, you made me believe that you did. And then he just turns around and says, just dagger, no, shouldn't have believed me. I loved you not. I never loved you, basically. And that's just a very, very harsh thing to say. And she says, I was the more deceived. And then you have a phrase that's going to be repeated a few times for your purposes. Excuse me, just know the speaker of this line, get thee to a nunnery. He's going to say over and over to her. And again, seems to be taking a lot of shots at women and how in some ways they're fake, he'll say. But again, remember, his anger in his life right now is really toward one woman, and it's not the woman standing in front of him. It is his mother. He feels very let down by her. He doesn't know exactly what's going on with her, but man, he's angry. He's called her weak. He's called her evil. And here he says, you as a woman should just go to a nunnery, and you should never get married. You should never have children. Humans are terrible. You're terrible. We're all terrible. So you should just get to a nunnery. And he's kind of just attacking women. And this woman standing in front of him has done nothing but love him and respect him and just be everything that he wanted her to be. And that's kind of how she is with everyone. She trusts everyone, and all these other people are treating her in these ways. So get thee to a nunnery, blah, blah, blah. He just goes through and says it over. I am proud, revengeful, ambitious, he says in his big speech. We as humans are just these terrible people. And then at the end of his speech, he says, where's your father? And she literally has no choice except to lie to him. She says he's at home. And she knows very well that he is behind that curtain with the king listening to this conversation. He kind of pieces it together. In fact, in the radio play that we use in class, Hamlet hears something from back there, and he says, where's your father? And he maybe has kind of pieced it together. And it's interesting, it depends on who's producing the particular film or stage play as to whether or not he asks, where's your father, because he hears something, or if he just asks, where's your father? But certainly she has to lie. So he says, maybe mark these 6 lines, starting with, if thou dost marry. If thou dost marry, I'll give thee this plague for thy dowry. Dowry is a wedding gift. Be thou as chaste as ice, pure as snow, thou shalt not escape calumny. Get thee to a nunnery, farewell. Or if thou wilt needs marry a fool. Wise men know well enough what monsters you make of them. To a nunnery go, and quickly to farewell. Look, you, woman, he says to her, and he just says it in a very harsh way. Usually you see this almost him screaming at her in the scene, depending on how it's presented to you. You, as a woman, should never get married. But if you are going to get married, marry a fool. Marry someone who's too stupid, if you will, to even understand what it is that what you'll do to him, what monster you'll make of him, how you'll ruin his life. And then he goes on to say, and here's a quote that you have pre-marked, I have heard of your paintings too well enough. God hath given you one face, you paint yourselves another. You make yourselves another. You jig, you amble, you lisp, you nickname God's creatures, and you make wantonness your ignorance. When he says you, he is not speaking in the singular tense, you, Ophelia. He is speaking about women, it seems. He's speaking in the plural tense. I have heard of your paintings too well enough. God has given you, women, one face. You make yourselves another. You jig and amble, you lisp. You act like you're all sweet and innocent. You nickname God's creatures. Basically, he's using these words to call her fake. You are fake. This is maybe worthy of discussion for you at some point in the test. Look, literally you fake by using a different face than God gave you. The idea of wearing makeup. Okay. Also, though, in your behavior, in your action, in your persona, you fake. You act like you're sweet and innocent. You nickname God's creatures, and you act like you're sweet and innocent and loving. But what you really are is, and again, the idea that women are evil, shots that he's thrown toward his mother in this play in his mind when he's just talking about her. You're fake. You, women, are fake. And he just basically crushes her And then the last thing he says before he runs off is, to a nunnery, go. And she immediately says, oh, what a noble mind here is overthrown. If she had any doubts as to whether or not he was in madness before, she does not now. She believes that he really is in a state of madness. Over on page 56, the last thing maybe really worth mentioning here for her is the quote, and just note the speaker, oh, woe is me to have seen what I have seen, to see what I see. She's very sad to have seen that he is gone. I do think you should mark the first 2.5 lines of Claudius's response when they come out from behind the curtain. Love, his affections do not that way tend, nor what he spake, though I'd like to form a little, was not like madness. Claudius seems to suspect that maybe he's not actually insane, which is interesting. Polonius thinks that it's love. Gertrude thinks that it's, his father's death, and they're getting married real quick. And even after hearing all this, Claudius, who is very devious and manipulative, it seems, thinks that maybe Hamlet is not being completely upfront about who he is and what he is at this point. He thinks maybe he's not actually in madness. He does mention a couple lines later that he plans to send him to England. He doesn't really know what's going on with Hamlet, but he thinks it's a good idea to get him out of town, so he's got a reason to collect some money that they owe, that he's going to, the premise of sending him is going to send him away. Of course, Polonius wants to stand by what he believes. Bottom of the page, the 5 lines, it shall do well, but yet I do believe the origin and commencement of his grief sprung from neglected love. Amalpha, you don't tell us what you don't have to tell us what Hamlet said. We heard it all. Polonius just wants to be right. Yes, I think he is mad, and it's because of love. That is a very key scene in this play, where we have the famous soliloquy, to be or not to be, and we have this exchange between Hamlet and Ophelia, which is very, very cruel and harsh. On the next scene, when we get to scene 2 from Act 3, we'll have the play within the play, and we're ready to get into that and see if Hamlet can find the evidence that he needs to prove that the ghost is telling him the truth. Thank you very much for enduring this 17-minute video. I hope it's somewhat useful to you, either for like a first read of trying to understand the play, or maybe just as a review if you were here the day we read. We're at the good stuff now. Let's keep on rolling. Thanks very much for watching and for listening. Okay, bye.